On behalf of the faculty of Yale Divinity School and our students and staff, I welcome you to this Yale Divinity School conference on theocracy, democracy in Islam, and Christianity. The conference is part of our efforts to address a significant topic of contemporary concern, located at one of the major fault lines in the global community. The Divinity School has long been a venue for bringing to bear the resources of the tradition of theological scholarship on such significant issues. For this effort, we've marshaled several resources. We first combined several of our endowed lectureships. The organizational effort for that was in the capable hands of the Divinity School Lecture Committee, chaired by Jean Outka, and on which sit Adela Collins and Miroslav Wolf. Working together with them was the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. This is a new research and outreach arm of Yale Divinity School, established 3 years ago to address the relationship between faith and all of human activity. Under the leadership of Miroslav Wolf and its executive director, David Miller, the center this year established a new program in Christian-Muslim reconciliation, which is directed by Joseph Cumming, who was here. And he worked closely with the lectureship committee in organizing this conference. David Miller, by the way, is in the back too. David, say wave to us. I want to say a special word of thanks to the organizing committee, to Jean Outka, to Joseph Cumming, to my executive assistant, Grace Pauls, who's minding the door, and to Evelyn Rodriguez in my office, who worked very hard to put this conference together. Let me say just a word about the endowed lectureships that have been combined for this event. The Bartlett Lecture was created in 1986 with a gift from the Reverend Robert M. Bartlett and his wife, Sue Bartlett, to address the areas of democracy, human rights, and world peace. The Loring Sabin Ensign Lectureship in Contemporary Interpretation of Religious Issues was established in 1994 to honor Reverend Ensign's 25 years of service as pastor of the Southport Congregational Church. And I believe Reverend Ensign is here. Is he? Yes. And his sister, Carol Bradshaw. Welcome, both of you. The Margaret Lindquist Sorensen Lectureship was funded by a gift from her son, Dr. Andrew A. Sorensen, and it provides an annual series of lectures on politics and ethics. And we also have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Sorensen, who was the president of the University of South Carolina. Andy, thank you. It's an honor, too, to welcome our keynote speakers, Oliver O'Donovan, Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford and Canon of Christ Church, Oxford, who will deliver the first keynote address, and Muhammad Qasim Zaman, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Brown University, and currently on leave of absence at the Institute for Advanced Study, not, alas, as the printed program indicates, at the Center for Theological Inquiry in Princeton, New Jersey, who will deliver the second keynote address tomorrow morning at 8:30. A brief note about our schedule. Immediately following the first lecture, at around 6:30 this evening, you were invited to the common room upstairs for a reception. We will resume our deliberations again with a panel at 8 p.m. this evening. We trust that this will allow you enough time to enjoy the reception, or if you prefer, to grab a quick dinner off campus. Tomorrow, immediately following panel 3, that is at 12:30 p.m., there will be time for participants to pick up a box lunch in the Sarah Smith Gallery, which is just inside the entrance where you registered for the conference, and then to return immediately here to Niebuhr Hall for a question and answer session and final responses from our lecturers. We realize that some of our Muslim guests will want to leave at that point for prayer. For those guests who wish to perform their weekly Jummah prayer at this time, Imam Yaha Hendi has graciously agreed to lead prayers with a brief khutbah in the Jonathan Edwards room. It will also be possible to participate in the Jummah prayer with the Muslim Students Association on Yale's Central Campus. Let me now turn over the program to Professor Jean Outka, who will chair this afternoon's session. Jean.
Well, I am honored and delighted to introduce Our first lecturer, Oliver O'Donovan. Professor O'Donovan was educated at Oxford and Princeton. He holds an MA and a D.Phil from Oxford. He was ordained as deacon in 1972 and priest in 1973. Throughout his career, Professor O'Donovan has served on many committees and boards of the Church of England. His research interests include Christian moral concepts, Christian social and political thought, contemporary ethical questions, and St. Augustine's moral and theological thought. He has served as editor of many journals, authored monographs, booklets, journal articles, reports, and translations. His books include The Problem of Self-Love in St. Augustine in 1980, The Desire of the Nations, Rediscovering the Roots of Political Theology in 1996, Just War Revisited in 2003, and The Ways of Judgment, the Bampton Lectures, published in 2005. So please join me in welcoming Professor O'Donovan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin just by thanking Gene, an old friend and indeed mentor, which he was too shy to say, for his very warm and generous welcome, to say how delightful it is to be back in Yale Divinity School again on what I was trying to work out, I think is my fourth visit, but also to say how honoured I am to be involved in this enterprise, which is a visit of a rather different kind, this conference in Theocracy and Democracy in Islam and Christianity. Conscious, I'm bound to say, of how much I have to learn in this field above all, and how far, certainly unless discussions in this country are very much more advanced than they are in mine, how far we all have to go before we know that we can speak of one another and about one another without crass misunderstanding. And so I particularly welcome this initiative. I'm honoured to be part of it. I am conscious that the contribution that I can make to our deliberations is limited, and so I'm grateful in a way to be allowed to kick it off so that we can go further than I have been able to go in this paper. Among the questions this conference has been asked to consider is whether Christians and Muslims may participate in good faith in the civil societies of North America and Europe, may do so without violating their religious convictions. And what I want to do is to consider one account, which I take to be a quite common account of how civil society in North America and Europe is normatively structured. And to the extent that this account is true, I shall argue, Western civil society does, in fact, create obstacles to the participation of believers in good faith. And not only of Muslim and Christian believers, but of believers as such. However, there may be better and more truthful ways of describing Western civil society, which in the end is, after all, not an idea, but an organism, a social organism of incredible complexity. And more truthful ways of describing its characteristically liberal disciplines. And it may be that these other ways of description do not entail such difficulties for believers. And towards the end of what I have to say, that is the possibility I want to explore in a very tentative way. Now, the view of civil society that I shall criticise is constructed around the proposal that religious beliefs must be subject to certain restraints upon their public expression. And the particular account I have in view and want to take up speaks of certain disabilities imposed on what it calls universal visions. These disabilities are argued for by analogy with the limits that every society imposes upon the pursuit of private interests. They're justified in terms of the need to domesticate profound disagreements or fundamental conflicts at the level of belief. But let me quote the view at length, and the source of the quotation is Robert Spemann's book, Personen, Persons, and since a good deal of what I shall have to say in this lecture will be by way of direct criticism of this passage, I should like to state at the outset that this is a book that I find, taken as a whole, unusually rich in persuasive insights, and my reaction to Spemann's work as a whole should not be judged from my reaction to this particular argument. What, Robert Spemann asks, can recognition of the person mean when set in a context of profound disagreement? The modern constitutional state, he says, has recognized the legitimacy of political conflict and has domesticated it. It has laid down the rules of play and has imposed observance of them as a condition of participation in legitimate conflict. Observance of the rules of play is the institutional form that personal recognition takes within the context of political disagreement. For what recognition means is that personality goes deeper than reason. Reason, as understood by Plato in the 18th century, was the means to universal agreement and the resolution of antagonisms. But in the age of the two world wars, reason itself became a cause of disagreement. The rules of procedure are not to be understood as purely pragmatic devices. It's not a matter of replacing justice with value-neutral rules of procedure, but of recognizing the persons involved in every conflict of justice, persons who have the right to uphold their view of the right against other views, and to promote their implementation to the extent that the rules allow. Naturally, he goes on, this imposes certain disabilities on universal visions, treated by analogy with private interests, which is certainly not how they see themselves. That cannot be helped. The idea that rational human nature, in leaving conflicts of interest behind, had to become, as Marx imagined it, a species animal, rests on a false understanding of what it is to be a person. To an incomparably higher degree than living creatures of kinds, persons are individuals. And that because of, not in spite of the fact that each represents a vision of the universal and the common, not merely her own or his own private interests. The confrontation of private interests is now reproduced at a higher level in terms of the definition of the common good. When, as in the plural constitutional state, there is in fact a definition held in common, it's a second-order definition that does not pretend to supersede the various competing universal visions, but to recognize their competition and domesticate it. Persons are recognized within such a state as creatures that are not exhaustively accounted for by natural particularities and perspectives. They can relate to their particularities, then, as to something that they have. They may have convictions incompatible with other people's, and may respect convictions they see as erroneous, without putting their own in question, in that they respect the person who has them. Now, this proposal, which is very densely spelled out in those two paragraphs I've just read, bears some family likenesses, which will, I suppose, be apparent to the programme for political liberalism that has been generally associated in the English-speaking world with the name of John Rawls. For our purposes, there are, it seems to me, two advantages in not discussing John Rawls. One is that in a world that has become very full of expositions and critiques of that great American political philosopher in his various phases, the conversation always risks being diverted along exegetical lines into questions of whether he's being fairly represented and so on. But there are some ideas that are prevalent enough that they really merit discussion, irrespective of whether they are or are not precisely what Rawls thought. The other reason is that this idea in particular, that of a republican disability, one might call it, imposed upon certain kinds of belief, has a prehistory that is, I think, independent of Rawls, and which I hope that one day someone may document for us through the European traditions of liberal thought. At the beginning of the Weimar Republic, for example, we find the argument alleged by distinguished figures that it was a Christian duty to support liberal candidates in elections, irrespective of one's own political beliefs. To take this idea up in a distinguished living philosopher in whom a basically Catholic orientation has been very interestingly enriched by a profound study of Rousseau, may offer us some new insights into the logic of this train of thought. Spemann's argument for the constitutional state, framed as it is by him within a broader defense of the legacy of Christian personalism, offers the theological critic much more hope of accommodation, and at the very least is not open to accusations of religious or moral skepticism. So I shall confine my remarks about Rawls to the briefest indications of how Spemann's very different account may at some points run parallel to his for significant moments of the journey. For each thinker there's an Archimedean point. Rawls' individual agent in that original position of ignorance of his or her lot in society finds a mirror image in Spemann's stripped-down person, the subject of all possible attributes. Persons, as he repeatedly tells us, relate to their particularities as to something they have. There is then a major difference between a self-regarding logic that carries the Rawlsian individual forward into social relationships and commitments, and the logic of mutual recognition that Spemann's person demands and affords. Furthermore, for Spemann, the transcendence of the person is not a formal heuristic device, as the original position is for Rawls, but is a substantive moral truth for which he holds we are, as a matter of historical fact, indebted to Christianity. The transcendence of the person then becomes the basis for a ranking of moral beliefs, in which a first-order set of norms, the universal vision, as he calls it, is subject to a second-order set of personalist norm-regulating norms, which take institutional form as the fundamental rules of public justice in the constitutional state. Here the parallelism emerges again, as the principles of public justice trump all universal visions. This does not make it impossible to hold such visions, but it does confine their public expression within the scope allowed by the fundamental laws. Spemann's theory addresses itself to the perceived problem of profound disagreement within political society. And in this respect, it's inclined to conceive the contemporary context of political theory as historically distinctive in its moral and its political pluralism. Remarkably enough, I have to confess, to the astonished gaze of an Englishman brought up to assume that modern constitutional norms go back at least as far as 1714 and perhaps to 1689, Spemann sees these as a post-Second World War development, a response to the titanic clash of left and right-wing totalitarianisms that dominated the history of continental Europe in the mid-20th century. And as a bulwark against profound disagreement, both theories seek to justify belief in a political agreement that is in the first place foundational, that is more basic than disagreements, and in the second place is unforced. Now, the second of these two conditions for political agreement will cause little trouble to any Christian account of society, at least. Most Western political doctrine has accepted the responsibility of showing that there can be a measure of agreement, something more, at least, than abject conformity imposed by force. Since Plato's Republic, it's been accepted in the West that the nihilistic might is right is a reductio ad absurdum of political philosophy, not a radical answer to the questions about existence in political community. This is a point at which modern liberal and traditional Christian are quite naturally at one, and whether that's because modern liberalism owes something to traditional Christianity, as both Spemann and I are inclined to suppose, is not something that need concern us here. Early modern Christian political doctrine accepted the second of these conditions, that agreement should be unforced, and did so even in the context of apologias for established political order against dissent, as in the case of the Anglican Richard Hooker, who wrote, "Neither wish we that men should do anything which in their hearts they are persuaded they ought not to do." The right of conscience is a commonplace of late scholastic moral doctrine. What is liable to disconcert those who think within the Christian tradition today, then, is not the second condition, but the way the first condition is conceived. The foundational or basic character of the terms of civil association. Now, this foundational character of civil association is perhaps the chief hallmark that separates the modern and the late modern versions of political doctrine from classical, medieval, and early modern political thought. How did the earlier political tradition manage without it? It achieved a confidence in the possibility of political agreement from two axiomatic beliefs that served as its pillars. In the first place, there was natural law, which was understood totally within the Christian tradition as a form of divine law. And it's very important when we use words like theocracy, that we remind ourselves that theocracy meant, at least for the earlier Christian tradition, among other things, a serious attention to the authority of natural law. The earlier tradition believed that agreement was, in large or small measure, assured by the created order of the universe. Despite their quarrels, human beings could agree on something in the end because they were created as reasonable beings with a common purchase on certain elementary truths about the world and about themselves. Once clarify what those elementary truths were, early modern Christians suggested, then we can know what measure of agreement can reasonably be looked for even between civilizations that are strangers to each other. And we may then distinguish disagreements that may be addressed by a discursive process of information, by instruction, by reasoning, in other words, by some form of disciplined intercommunication on the one hand, from those disagreements that simply mask contumacious and malevolent dispositions, which can properly be met with force on the other. Now, Vittoria's classic treatment of the American Indians can be read, I think, as simply as a determined application of this program to the colonial confrontation of Christian and pagan civilizations. And when we face up to the peculiar questions presented to us by the new geographical dispositions of religious groupings, for that's, I suppose, what we're dealing with within the world today as a result especially of massive post-colonial migration, we have to remember that the shock to our system can hardly be as great as the shock in the 16th century created by the discoveries of completely new and separate civilizations to European travellers in the 16th century, and the kinds of intellectual questions about unity of vision that those posed. And it's helpful, perhaps, to see when we face the peculiar difficulties of our age that, well, our traditions have been there before and have made something of that situation. Hugo Grotius, another favourite of mine, also had the colonial context in view when he argued that the existence and moral authority of God falls into the category of elementary natural faith, while God's Trinitarian being falls into the category of revealed faith, so that atheism and irreligion are, in theory, possible titles for a just war, whereas polytheism, anti-Trinitarianism are not titles for a possibly just war. Natural law is founded on a belief in creation. It interprets disagreements within a context of created order. It is, one might say, an item of moral faith in the Kantian sense. Now, the second pillar of their building was the authority of government. I continue the quotation from Hooker that I began a moment ago. Neither wish we that men should do anything which in their hearts they are persuaded they ought not to do, but this persuasion ought, we say, to be fully settled in their hearts, that in litigious and controverted causes of such quality, the will of God is to have them do whatsoever the sentence of judicial and final decision shall determine. Yea, though it seem in their private opinion to swerve utterly from that which is right. Now here perhaps we may detect in embryo the modern conception of the restraint of belief. However, we miss the point unless we see that it's grounded quite differently, because it arises from a specific obligation to respect the judgments of a political authority, which is itself an item of first-order belief to Christians, Hooker argues. That means that the beliefs of Hooker's Puritan opponents are supposed to be self-regulating. Their belief in God's will for a sentence of judicial and final decision, as he calls it, sets the proper limits to their belief in God's will for the introduction of Reformed church order. They're not asked, in other words, to act on something other than what they believe. Now, Hooker's exposition at this point, to be sure, is somewhat idiosyncratic. His Counter-Reformation and Calvinist contemporaries would have made more, I think, of the mutually limiting effects of the two elements of belief, and would have avoided the impression that Hooker can sometimes give that belief in political authority settles all questions. Yet in broad terms, Hooker situated where the central stream of Christian moral theology flowed. The responsibility of every agent is to act upon what he or she thinks right. But to do that reflectively in the course of conscientious self-correction, taking a stand on a mature and comprehensive judgment, not on an instantaneous and superficial one. It's not another person's point of view to which the believer is told to defer. It's the believer's own conviction that God has willed there to be institutions of justice which are to be obeyed in general terms, even when they make misjudgments. Now, these two items of moral faith armed early modern Christians with an optimism about agreement in society, which is strikingly absent from the modern formulae, as well as a sense of responsibility for maintaining it that is sometimes rather less peremptory than the modern formulae. Late modern political theory, setting itself the problem of positing agreement without appeal to underlying truths about human nature, natural or revealed, while it propounds, as any political theory must, an account of the authority of the state, reverses the order of things. Instead of encountering the authority of political institutions as a creative gift of God, the modern subject is thought to generate the authority of political institutions by a coordinated act of will. Neither nature nor institution, therefore, commands an innate authority that the reasonable dissident must, for sheer reasonableness, defer to. And this is what tends to invest the modern doctrine of restraint of belief with its somewhat peremptory character. We are required to have second-order beliefs which regulate our first-order beliefs, but why one set of beliefs should regulate, the other set of beliefs be regulated, remains mysterious. It rests in the end on the pragmatic claim that it works, or more ominously, that it could be made to work if we would only sacrifice our primary convictions. And at this point, the suspicion arises that liberal doctrine has not actually managed to dispense with authoritarianism, but has merely redistributed it. It's surely a serious theoretical weakness if, in attempting to emancipate the subject from alienated authority, it comes back in the end to saying, well, thou shalt not. Now, of Spemann's version of the liberal theory, there is much more to be said than that, of course, because he is firmly minded to ground the appeal in a substantive ontological belief about the person, an item of moral faith that he happily characterizes as a Christian legacy. Yet his proposal still bears the characteristic modern shape in two respects. In the first place, the belief in the person on which fundamental laws are grounded is not itself part of the public commitment of the constitutional state, nor of its citizens. While the philosophical Christian may have the satisfaction of knowing that how constitutional rules of practice may be justified, the rules stand quite independently of their justification, which means that belief in the person has no hermeneutic role in guiding the application of the rules. At this point, we're reminded perhaps of Maritain's proposal a couple of generations ago of a civic faith that could be held in common from a variety of confessional positions. The civic faith would be public and binding, essentially democratic faith, while the belief systems that argued for this faith would be inculcated in the semi-privacy of separate confessional schools and educational establishments and would not be appealed to in public. This relation of belief to practice looks alarmingly like what we call legitimation, a word I take to describe a one-way relation between belief and the rules of public practice, where belief supports but does not moderate the demands that society makes upon us. Legitimation is usually thought disreputable from an intellectual point of view, seeming to argue in support of practical conclusions that have been decided on other undeclared grounds. One can imagine some successful defences against this charge, and it's possible that Spemann's theory can be so interpreted as to be defensible against it. He may, for example, be taken to say that since the practices of the constitutional state are historically derived from Christian belief, they are threatened with unintelligibility if this external dependence on Christianity is forgotten, even though they are internally independent of any justification Christianity might provide for them, and so on. But the second modern feature in Spemann's doctrine of the constitutional state is that respect for the person is, as we may put it, disaggregated by virtue of its regulative position from all other beliefs that we may hold. It doesn't function as an integral part of the belief system, qualifying and being qualified by other things that are believed, since it has to stand apart from all universal visions, which are also described as beliefs about the common good. Here, his presentation may be open to two divergent readings. First, one might say, a less radical one. If we rest our interpretation on that sentence that refers to Marx's concept of the species animal, then we may conclude that by universal visions, he means only ideologies in a narrower political sense. That is, political programs that aim to establish social regularity and overcome idiosyncrasy. In this sense, Marxists can be thought to have universal visions, Nazis can be thought to have universal visions, perhaps even liberals might be thought to have universal visions, but religious believers and romantics cannot be thought to have them. We could then render Spemann's view somewhat uncontroversially as the simple assertion of a superiority of a complex personalist account of human being over against the generic species animal that is assumed in such political programs. Persons are individuals, politicians treat us as masses, that kind of thing. The business of the constitutional state would then be the purely political one of preventing us being treated so much as masses that we couldn't be individuals, restrain the political ideologies in deference to a personality that lies beyond the ken of ideology, though not beyond the ken of philosophy or theology, which knows what human beings really are. Well, that, one might think, would be a fairly, as I say, a comfortably Catholic position for Spemann to hold, and perhaps in one move that is the position he holds. Obviously, he is particularly concerned in this passage, as a German of his generation might very well be, with the problems of political ideology and what they did to Europe. But to sustain that interpretation of his words is difficult, principally because it makes no sense of that telling sentence about personality going deeper than reason. A sure indication, I think, that Rousseau is in control of Spemann's thought at that point. So on a more radical interpretation, he thinks that any comprehensive theoretical doctrine about the conditions of human social flourishing is subject to censorship by the principles of personality. That will include Christian doctrines, such as those which have derived from the initiatives of Pope Leo XIII and proved so influential in the 20th century, or those which have inspired some European Calvinists to impressive achievements of social and political creativity. Christians, too, would have to be bidden to restrain the prosecution of their universal vision in deference to personality. But here Spemann would part company with a classical Christian doctrine of restraint, such as Hooker's. Christians will have to restrain their views without any internal modification of them. The implication of the first-order, second-order distinction is that the regulative second-order belief does not pretend to supersede the various competing universal visions, simply to recognize their competition and domesticate it. At first glance, one might think this would secure the position of the believer. His belief will be safe if he joins in according to the rules of the constitutional state. We shall go on being Marxists, Muslims, Christians, whatever, and we will go on urging precisely the same points of view as we would have urged anyway, but we shall do so without any expectation of being listened to, since the ground rules of the constitutional state, which are not merely rules of procedure, as he's careful to point out, impose substantial limits upon all forms of social order, like the limits that's just been imposed on me just at that moment. A kind of visual aid of what the ground rules do. It's difficult to find, in Spemann's words, any very clear statement of just what he thinks will be disallowed, but it does become clear that a social order must at least be accepting of fundamental dissent. No point of view is taken as normative for all citizens, except a point of view on the second-order principles of social organisation. This, however, ensures that while dissent on doctrines about the common good is allowed, I may think differently from you, nobody may include in his doctrine the belief that it would be good if everybody believed the same thing. That is to say, I may think differently from you, but among the things I think, I may not include the idea that it would be a very good idea if you came to think what I did. Unless, of course, that same thing is precisely the belief that it's not good for everybody to believe the same thing. Now, common sense here ought to be allowed a voice, I think, and common sense tells us something slightly but crucially different from this. Common sense would tell us, surely, that it would be good if everybody believed the same thing by mutual and completely unforced argument. That is, if everybody, carefully attentive to one another, came to believe the same thing. But this common sense view envisages a state of affairs outside the purview of the constitutional state, as Spemann has envisaged it, because that is predicated on fundamental disagreement. In other words, the constitutional state, in order to be normative, must make its presupposition of disagreement normative too. The rules of the constitutional state overrule what common sense suggests in this respect. Now, my leading point is simply that these rules are, in effect, more restrictive than they appear. There are various ways in which that point can be argued, and it often is, in relation to the missionary aspirations of both Christianity and Islam. But I don't want to pursue these at the moment. My interest is quite particularly in the tendency to introduce radical incoherence into the structure of belief itself. And this shows up particularly clearly in the case of Christianity, precisely because it's credited with originating this doctrine of the person that underlies the constitutional state. In this case, the effect of the distinction between first-order and second-order beliefs is precisely to prevent the integration of Christian belief in the person, the regulative belief, with the Christian universal vision, the concept of the common good. Christians are bound, as it were, to believe in personality on the one hand and on society on the other hand, with two unrelated sides of their minds, one might say. The regulative belief must leave the universal vision substantially unaffected. So Christians can't proceed according to the traditional practical logic of correcting the conscience, by which one thing that you believe is qualified and interpreted and made sense of in the light of another thing that you believe. Respect for the person must be held as a commitment independent of whatever else Christians are held to believe. Now, and if Spemann did not insist on this point, then the result would be that the Christian universal vision would be a privileged one, accorded a uniquely authoritative status among alternative universal visions, and that, I'm sure, is not actually what he intends. Now, simply as a description of how believers' thought about person and society proceeds, this separation is gravely improbable. It seems obvious, and Spemann's own work affords plentiful illustrations of it, that Christian belief in the common good is permeated through and through by Christian belief in the person, while Christian construal of personal dignity is permeated through and through by belief in social goods. So the distinction into first order and second order belief jars painfully with any operative Christian philosophy, and not least the philosophy that shapes Spemann's own wider project. But let's take a step back. Let's suppose that it's only the fundamental laws themselves that are assigned this regulative status. The underlying view of the transcendence of the person is free for integration into philosophical and theological reflection. But then the problem arises once again that the regulative principles of the constitutional state are merely peremptory, without foundation. For if Christian philosophy is to integrate its view of the person into its first order reflections on society, it must be able to do so with an open-minded exploration of all the possible ways of implementing that personalist view practically. It must at least be able to ask questions like, may we not pay respect to the persons of erroneous believers by fraternal correction? May we not pay respect to them by re-educating them, or by allowing them the dignity of martyrdom? Well, there are plenty of proposals of this kind in the history of both Christian and Muslim thought. The laws of the constitutional state are, in the end, only one among a number of possible strategies for respecting persons, in which case Christian reflection cannot defer to those laws a priori before measuring them against other possible personalist alternatives. Or if it does defer to them, then it does so for some other reason, a reason not made explicit by Spemann, and perhaps it is the reason that Hooker urged upon doubtful opponents of the Anglican settlement. Not out of respect to the content of the laws, but out of respect for the God-given authority of an established political judgment. The incoherence that threatens Christian belief from the conditions of the constitutional state must, it seems to me, a fortiori, threaten any other universal vision too. If those who hold reasoned views of the common good are expected to acquiesce freely in regulative controls on their pursuit of their reasoned views, this can be recommended to them either in terms of the views that they hold, or on grounds independent of the views that they reasonably hold. And if they acquiesce freely on grounds independent of the reasoned views they hold, then incoherence is introduced into their reasoning. Or else their views change. That is, they come to modify their views in the light of these new reasons. To see why this has to be so, consider what's implied in characterizing a belief system as a universal vision. In the first place, this clearly implies that the beliefs in question are practical or action guiding, not simply beliefs about things, but beliefs that direct what is to be done. It implies, in the second place, that these beliefs are comprehensive. They do not simply direct what is to be done in certain specific types of situation, though they may do that, but what is to be done overall, how life is to be lived. Now, it may seem in the first place that some religious beliefs do not meet the first of these criteria for a universal vision. Religious beliefs are often of a different type. They are explanatory or interpretive beliefs rather than practical and action-guiding beliefs. However, it is characteristic of religions in general, and certainly of the religions of the book, that they insist on a very strong link between explanatory and practical belief. The claim that faith implies corresponding practice is not distinctive to Christianity or Islam, though it is emphasized in both. So though we may distinguish abstractly between explanatory beliefs and practical beliefs, they are united in any religious believer concretely, whose religious faith is properly thought to be action-guiding. In the second place, it may seem that not every universal vision is comprehensive as well as practical. There are views of ethics that reject the idea of a single hegemonic principle to be adhered to in all circumstances by everybody. Yet if we loosen the notion of the comprehensive vision just a bit to accommodate negative principles as well as positive principles, it's more difficult to imagine doing without that claim. Someone who believes very strongly, for example, in a tolerant society can be said to have a comprehensive vision to the extent that minimizing interference is for that person a principle that governs their reactions to everything else. The key point here is that the believer in a universal vision holds practical beliefs, whether specific or unspecific, that seem universally valid and decisive in any conflict of lesser values. And here we must make a remark in passing upon the difficulty of that analogy which Behmann suggested between universal visions and private interests. It's certainly not how they see themselves, he admits. And to be honest, it's hard to see why anybody else should see them in that light either. The point of a universal vision is that it attempts to overcome private interests in a view of the common good. One may protest against a proposed universal vision that it fails to do what it pretends to do, and still does, in fact, incorporate sectional interests. Anyone who holds such a vision is then bound to accept the damaging character of that charge and either rebut it or refine the universal vision in some way so as to escape it. One may perhaps protest against all universal visions, that they uniformly and consistently fail to do what they pretend to do, in which case one holds a skeptical view about their pretensions, somewhat like Thrasymachus' view of justice in Plato's Republic, that justice is the interest of the stronger. But of course such a view can only be deconstructive. Thrasymachus didn't really intend to tell us what justice is. He only intended to tell us that what people think justice is something that is not. Let's put the difficulty like this. There are no analogies to private interests, neither could there be any analogies to private interests. The good which the universal vision claims to descry either is the common good, as it claims to be, transcending sectional interests, or it is not. It makes no sense to say that it is a vision of the common good that is analogous to the private pursuit of sectional interests. I hope that the nature of the incoherence which Behmann's concept of the constitutional state is introducing into our beliefs should now be becoming apparent. It wants to introduce a supremely regulative practical principle over views already conceived as comprehensively regulative, and that without making any difference to them. But the regulative status of the rules of the constitutional state could only be compatible with beliefs that either were not in themselves practical beliefs. There need be no conflict, for example, between them and a belief in the unity of God, or not in themselves comprehensive beliefs, there need be no conflict between them and belief in certain religious duties, such as keeping Friday or Sunday as a holy day. Religious belief does not consist simply of non-practical beliefs and non-comprehensive moral beliefs. Neither do other beliefs that are dignified with the general title universal visions consist solely in those two kinds of things. So our difficulties with this idea of the constitutional state are not confined to special difficulties that Christians or Muslims may encounter with it. They have to do with the way it treats the beliefs of its participants as such, with its claim to propound a reason transcending reason that in effect refuses the practical comprehensiveness of their world visions, and so prevents the justification and critique of a political system in terms of what those who participate in it believe about God, about the world, and about themselves. And it's precisely this feature that places the liberal constitutional state so construed in the tradition of political theory that's developed since the 17th century, when thinkers entrenched authoritarianism by assigning a foundational status to the rules of association. But, of course, the special claim made by the late modern liberal political order was to overcome authoritarianism. What supposedly differentiates the liberal order from the authoritarian society that precedes it was its willingness to allow its demands and its abridgments of individual freedoms to be subject to the hazards of a critical discourse. It confidently entrusted the state to the judgment of participants' reflective convictions about themselves, one another, and God, in the absence of any metaphysical or religious censorship. That is, as it were, what the program stated. But the meaning of this hierarchical ranking of first-order and second-order beliefs is precisely that this promise is being gone back on. For the discourse of justification is not, after all, to be framed in terms of what participants actually believe. It's not to appeal to terms of universal visions that they actually hold. It's to be damped down, channeled along certain predictable and usually materialist lines. The restraint of belief in the public discourse of the constitutional state, or the suggestion of such a thing, is evidence of a certain loss of confidence within the liberal political order, prompted perhaps by the encounter with grand totalitarian philosophies of the 20th century, but also by insecurity in the face of the revival of religious politics, and perhaps by the overstretching of certain utopian aspirations in the liberal political tradition itself. And here we may raise a question in passing on its self-presentation as a rationality for coping with fundamental disagreement. Does not that assume what has to be proved, a bit like a quack doctor demonstrating medical credentials by curing pains that nobody has thought of complaining of yet? Because it's not a fact that modern society is pluralist. Pluralism is an interpretation. It's an interpretation that has to prove itself by reference to the actual state of affairs. There is as much disagreement as there is. There is also as much agreement as there is. And the impression one can get, in Britain at least, is that a great deal more agreement could often be found, particularly among the religious communities, than the maintainers of the official doctrine are ever prepared to look for or to find. It may be thought that the evolution of liberalism along these lines is simply a late awakening from a utopian dream to a hard truth about political society. It involves a painful coming to terms between institutions and practices of power on the one hand, and the conceptions of identity and justice that give intelligibility to the public world on the other hand. The completely uncensored, undirected discourse of justification that seemed to be promised was, after all, never more than an aspiration and could not be. Democracy always needed its political parties to tell people what they were supposed to think. Excluding beliefs from public discourse can then be seen as a very traditional ploy on the part of institutions of power to protect their overstretched resources in an ideologically unstable and perhaps dangerous situation. And perhaps that is all the case. But in awaking from utopian dreams, as from other dreams, there may be moments at which elements of the dream world cling on to dawning reality, and the line between first order and second order belief, serving to save the face of traditional liberal hostility to censorship, is itself something of a dreaming proposal. And it is philosophy's role, one would hope, at least to dispel it, not to erect it as some kind of principle that should be binding in foro interno. Well, all that I've said up to this point has been directed against a certain theory of the constitutional state which raises difficulty for believers' participation. The question of whether Christians and Muslims can participate in the thing itself still remains open. That doesn't mean that this discussion is wholly without urgency and abstract. Since political theory is never purely descriptive, but is always practical theory, prescribing normative procedures, it can sometimes trade on a false appearance of descriptive competence in order to generate practices that conform to it, so verifying itself, as it were, in the outcome, even if it was not true at first. And this has the corollary that there need to be alternative accounts of liberal civil society in circulation. And providing them is a task that falls to philosophers and theologians. So let me, in conclusion, merely give a few hints of what a moral theologian can make of one, at least, of the liberal practices that modern civil society professes to value very highly and to be built upon, that of compromise. What can be said in favour of compromise without invoking this strategy of the first order and the second order belief? Here, as in much of what I've said, my proposals take on a distinctively Christian character and cannot pretend to speak in any way for Muslim believers. And I take the view here that it's much better not to try to second-guess what Muslim believers might wish to say at this point. That by no means implies that I think Islam is without significant resources in this regard, or could and should have a lot to say for itself, precisely on parallel lines to this. Well, I've said that a religious belief is, as such, action guiding. A term that may conveniently be used for a belief which has prescriptive implications is moral belief. Now, moral beliefs are not all religious beliefs. The secular liberal may very well claim to have moral beliefs that are held, at least independently of religious beliefs. The equality of all human beings would be an example of such a belief. The important point for our purposes is that all religious belief is moral belief. But moral beliefs are of different orders, and they may guide our actions in different ways. We speak, for example, of moral ideals, which do not guide our actions directly or immediately, but shape our long-term aspirations, and so guide them indirectly. We speak of obligations, which claim to be enacted immediately. And in between the indirectness of the ideal and the immediacy of the obligation, we may speak of principles that provide a rational framework for deliberation, or about priorities, which will order our principles, and so on, and so on. To be guided in action by our beliefs is an essential condition of freedom. It's not all that is implied in the term freedom. A full account of freedom would have to include something about the truth of our beliefs and their sufficiency. Nevertheless, dissonance of belief and practice is clearly always going to be a form of unfreedom, which is why the fathers of the church said the most pernicious form of slavery was sin. When we're compelled to act in ways that we cannot justify within our beliefs, so that we can't account for what we've done to ourselves and to others as an exercise of our own practical reason and freedom, then we find ourselves in a position of impotence. And when public order presents us with demands that we cannot justify to ourselves on any account, we experience that order as coercive and unfree. However, public order is indispensably coercive at some points, and the question of justifying public order comes down to this. On what basis can we justify deferring to demands made by public order that do not correspond to what we would anyway justify doing for its own sake? Is there a sphere of freedom available within political order taken in its coercive sense? Which is to say, can we recognize and approve of undertakings within the context of public order that we could not recognize and approve of otherwise? And it's the role of a theory of political authority to try to achieve that mediation between freedom and coercion. In this way of posing the problem, we can see already hints of the first order, second order distinction that has been characteristic of the liberal constitutional theory we've been thinking of. But that distinction has done no more essentially than restate the problem in the guise of an answer. The religions of the book, in speaking at this point of political order as rooted in the institution of God, undertake to reconcile the paradoxical relation of authority and freedom by rooting our obligations to the civil order in our first order beliefs, or in our beliefs that are our own beliefs, as it were. And the simplest way to understand how they do this is to see how they handle compromise. Compromises are decisions, explicit or implicit, not to act immediately on one given moral belief. We make compromises when we view certain beliefs as impracticable, either absolutely impracticable or simply immediately impracticable here and now. Such decisions are reached as we recognize constraints on our freedom to do what we would wish, constraints of circumstance, endowment, or simply finitude in the most general sense. And there are both good and bad compromises. Compromise is an essential part of any deliberation that has to take note of complex features in situations and conceive of actions that will express all aspects of the situation it confronts. On the other hand, compromises sometimes mark failures in deliberation, when they're overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation and take a short cut through it, which results in action that fails to express our beliefs adequately. Good compromise is realistic in the best sense. It squares up to difficulties, focuses attention on what's most important, forces us to give up trying to do everything in order to do the one thing needful. Bad compromise gives in to constraints that could and should have been overcome, and especially gives in to the general opinion of other people against our own deepest convictions. The difference between good and bad compromise turns on whether belief can be claimed persuasively as affording a reason for the action taken. Human agents are involved in compromise as they move in and out of the public sphere of action. They have public responsibilities, familial responsibilities, responsibilities to themselves, They're the points on which abstract forms of public order, private welfare, inner truthfulness all converge on concrete decisions. It's necessary for the freedom of human agents that the rules governing public conduct should be consistent with their moral beliefs so that their compromises may be good ones, not bad ones. On the other hand, it's necessary to the range of their undertakings that not every belief prescribes immediately for every situation, but that the application of moral belief can be mediated through a range of shifting but always principled compromises. These compromises are not simply occasionalistic, they may also be embodied in rules. So there may be rules for public conduct that differ from rules from private conduct. If you're a police officer inquiring about the conduct of a suspect, you betray no emotion at the information your questions elicit. If you're a parent inquiring about the conduct of your teenage child, you do show emotion at the information you elicit. Someone who is both an officer and a parent will behave either way, depending on the role he or she is occupying. The difference in behavior will be explicable to self, explicable to others, with the aid of a believable account of the differing roles of officer and parent within the human, personal and social good. To return to the principal point we've been arguing, the concept of a separate public sphere governed wholly by its own self-sufficient public rules is unsustainable in terms of practical reason. The political philosopher, we may say, is not as such a human being. Any real-life political philosophy is a moment in the thoughts and actions of some actual human being who thinks not only about systems and societies, but about much else besides. If that human being is to attain moral integrity, political reflections must be integrated into the wider-ranging trains of thought by which he or she believes that a human being may have life. Thank you very much.